my favorite professor, Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, showed up in Paris, and he said, the greatest thing in the world has happened to me, and I want to share it with you. Well, what would you say? So I said, no. And I thought he was going to tell me a story.
Yeah.
And instead, he opens his jacket and takes out a little bottle of pills. And at that point, I'm so straight, I don't drink coffee. But what do you do when someone says that to you and puts a pill in your hand? So that evening, which was what we would now call a moderate dose of psilocybin, opened up my awareness that the self-concept I had was simply very limited, and that my attachments to my kind of pretentiousness to being of interest and so forth were incredibly shallow. Now, skip forward a few remarkably interesting weeks, and my draft board and I made an agreement, which is if I went to graduate school, they would not send me to Vietnam. And I felt that was patriotic on both sides, as I would have been a terrible soldier. And a few weeks at Stanford, I met people working at something called the International Foundation for Advanced Study, a little suite of offices above a beauty parlor in Menlo Park, and 2 doors down from a Christian Science reading room, and around the corner from a bakery. So this was not a massive institution, but on October 16th, 1961, I had what I would call now a full psychedelic experience where my identity of being Jim Fadiman was transcended, and that what I realized that I was part of a kind of larger entity, which was actually connected to not only every living thing, but everything, a kind of classic mystical experience of unity or interconnectedness. And I am very grateful that I've never recovered.
Yeah.
So that took my interest from conventional psychology, which I wasn't that interested in anyway, into this area of what is consciousness and how can you best understand the actual world we live in. My background, or my foreground, I was a graduate student in psychology, so I looked at psychology through this new lens. So that the personal background of an individual prior to a major psychedelic experience is not that relevant, but it is what obviously we all start with when we have a major experience. It's the same, which is the loss of individual self and the awareness that is more true than the feeling of an individual self. What the Buddhists call delusion, which is what we call personal identity.
That when you started exploring this realm of human inquiry, it was prior to the illegality of many of these substances. And I know you lived through kind of the dark ages.
The 40 years of wandering in the desert and wondering how to get here, yes.
And I know there's so much that must have happened during that time, but for people that are unfamiliar with the 70s, 80s, 90s, what sticks with you about what happened during that time, what we may have lost? How do you make sense of all of the lost opportunities and lost time? Obviously, some people were doing research, like I know that you were. How do you make sense of that era in general?
Well, it's a little bit like what we're now doing with climate change, is that time actually matters, and that when you lose a time of possibilities, those times don't reoccur. So right now, we lost 40 years of seeing psychedelics as we're now seeing them as potentially remarkable tools for really helping us in both mental health, physical health, and what's called enhanced wellness. We lost all of those, not only all of those years, but all of the really literally millions of people who could have been helped. And we also, if I look at the culture in general, what we have lost is optimism. And I just have been helping get that published, a lecture that Abraham Maslow, the father of both humanistic and transpersonal psychologies, gave in 1969. And it's incredibly cheerful and optimistic and upbeat and full of examples of how the culture is changing, how education is becoming relevant, how the growth centers are becoming part of the culture. It's strident optimism.
Yeah.
And I don't see that today. And that's a species-wide shift. And that perhaps, and that part of what we lost was the advantages that psychedelic experiences have had, both for healthy people and for ill ones.
Because to me, it's an area of great hope for people, and I think, I don't know if you would agree with this, but so much of perhaps why there is such pessimism, and I would agree with you right now in America, not in every single form of life, but in general, I think you get a sense of that, is that so many people are not well. They don't feel well, and I think they're often a bit adrift spiritually, and this is an area of hope just for me personally that I have for the country. I want to get into that because I know, so much of, I think the work that you have done is being, it's taken a lot of energy on your side to continue with this, that you must have held a conviction that there were elements to these experiences that could really help people and could really improve their quality of life. And to me,
the question for me was, once psychedelics were made illegal, and it didn't occur to me to kind of go underground.
Yeah.
I was kind of a legal guy, and when you work legally, illegal doesn't have the same attractiveness. But what I had to say is, if I and many other people had learned something from psychedelics, could we apply that in the culture? And if you look at the 60s through an optimistic lens, that's the beginning of the women's movement. That's the beginning of the social justice movement. That's the beginning of the ecology movement and the anti-war movement. And those were all fueled by people with psychedelic experiences. So those were these major thrusts toward making the planet both a better place physically and a better place emotionally. And that work continues. So one of the things I was involved in is starting really helping to start a school of psychology called transpersonal, meaning beyond the personal or the personality, because psychology had decided that spiritual experiences were, first of all, unimportant, and second of all, likely pathological. And since that wasn't my experience and the experience of thousands of others, there was a hunger for a psychology that covered all of human experience. And all of human experience meant not only psychotics and serial killers on the one end of the continuum, but saints and geniuses on the other. And so that was one of the things that I helped establish, was that position that human beings were neither inherently good or evil, but had a capacity for enormous good and enormous better quality of life. So this was not about recovering from mental illness. This was recovering from a limited point of view.
I think I heard you say this in a prior interview, that this was, I think, a line from your daughter, and you were talking about the 1960s, and she was mentioning that this may have been a word she invented, which was something like FUD, that in the 60s, when you're trying to make progress in life and you're trying to grow, you often fall straight on your face, something like that. And
that's right. No, that was Maria, who's now a full professor and ethnobotanist. But the word she invented was flump. And when flumps, one goes into a situation where one has no idea what to do, and you just show up and throw yourself in. My other daughter, more sensible and more cautious, we describe her as saying she would hover about the edges until she saw what was going on and figured it out and then go in.
Yeah.
And I'd say that the psychedelic people, to the extent that we made mistakes in the 60s, it was from an excess of plumping. And we were also, that was also the first time in human history when birth control for women was available.
Yeah.
And that the sexual revolution, as it was called, was possible because both sexes could participate in it. And that was disruptive to the theories, not to the actual living experience, but to the theories of many, many people that free sexual expression, because it had always been dangerous, must be bad. So that was among the areas. I'm just remembering another group, Humanistic Psychology, had its annual convention in a hotel in Washington. And the hotel afterwards asked them never to come back. And they said that they could handle some of the nudity, but when people were making love on the stairs, in the lobby stairs, that was too much. And I thought, they're right.
Yeah.
that flaunting one's liberation is not yet liberation.
You just said this, that during when the psychedelic movement became illegal, or when psychedelics became illegal, that you're more inclined to be a law-abiding man and citizen. What in general during those decades was your primary focus of emphasis in your own professional work? You already alluded to the work that you were doing with transpersonal psychology, but what did you see were your opportunities to stay as a legal participating member in society, yet also keep the flame alive to some degree?
Well, I'm not sure I was much of a flame keeper aliver, except in helping to establish both humanistic psychology about human caring and basically positive psychology, and transpersonal. I earned a living doing a succession of odd jobs, but I also, with a friend, we did start an independent graduate school, where we were teaching, quote, transpersonal psychology, which meant that our students had a much, much higher barrier to getting their PhD than I had at Stanford, because we were demanding not only intellectual rigor, and when we were investigated by state and federal agencies, they said, your dissertations are really good, meaning we didn't expect it.
Yeah.
But also our students had to have capacity in a physical skill enough so they could teach it, like Aikido or yoga. They had to have spent a certain amount of time under trained meditation. And they also had to at least work in some kind of aesthetic with arts, so that we felt we were trying to train not a psychologist, but a human being.